Hey guys, it's Nav, and I'm going to be talking about some concepts that are in my upcoming book, but without actually reading out of my book. I'm still working on the title, but the working title is The Book of Edges, The Edge of No Limit Hold'em, Poker Freedom Fighters, The Liberation of American Dollars, a love story, and it's a true story. No, those are jokes, but it's going to be dealing with the three edges in poker and the only other way you can win money at poker, which is fold equity before the flop. So, yeah, we win money in poker by not making mistakes, but more fundamentally than that, we win money in poker by betting, and we do that by either making a bet that gets value out of our opponent's hands, and by gets value, I mean puts us in a situation to win the lion's share of the money put into the pot, or at least more than our fair share of the money that goes into the pot after the flop, um, or by getting our opponent or opponents to surrender their equity before the flop. So we win by uh, betting, and we do that by getting our opponent to fold, so fold equity, and by going to the flop with an edge, um, with one or more of the three post-flop advantages, which are skill, position, and card advantage. But it really all comes down to betting. How do the edges really work? So the only way that these edges work is they work by helping us to avoid making mistakes while inducing mistakes from our opponents. I mean, really, that's it. You make fewer mistakes than your opponent, then you win money. That's just how the game works. And when we're talking about mistakes, we're talking about bets that are made or bets that are not made. We're talking about bets that are called or bets that are not called. And the three ways you have to kind of uh, use as leverage against your opponent are position, skill advantage, and card advantage. But they're all about one thing: um, putting yourself in a situation where you are going to make fewer mistakes than your opponents. That's it. That's the whole deal. So, looking at just the edge of position under this light. If you're in position, you're going to make fewer mistakes because you're going to have more information to work on by the time it gets to you. So, when you have to make a decision, that's when you have an opportunity to make a mistake or not. When you're in position, you have just a little bit more information to base each decision you make on, and it turns out to be about an additional street's worth of information in most scenarios. I mean, it really is an additional street's worth of information in all scenarios, but it doesn't always function that way. And the other thing is, not only are you acting with information, but you're going to get an extra street in which to act on that information. So you're going to be able to better control the size of the pot, and you're going to be doing that with a better idea of what your villain's hand range looks like. Um, by controlling the size of the pot, what we really mean is by uh, being in position, we're able to give our opponent the decision, put them in a spot where it's going to be difficult for them to not either call too many bets with their mediocre hands or to fold too often. Like if we're playing well, we're playing in position, then it's going to be really tough for our opponent to not either fold too often or call too many bets with his mediocre hands. If we've got a value hand, it's also going to be easier for us to build a pot. If we have like a mediocre hand, it's going to be easier for us to get to showdown without having to put too many bets in. So when we're in position, if our opponent has a big hand and we have a big hand, if our hand is just like nutted value and he's got like a good hand, at some point he's going to have to either check call, check call, check call, and in that case he's going to have to risk missing a street of value from our better hands that aren't as good as his hand, like our two pairs against his sets. Or he's going to have to risk value owning himself by check raising with a inferior hand, or he's going to have to risk letting us off the hook by allowing us to correctly fold when he has a monster hand. But when we're in position, if he bets, then we can raise the turn or the river. If he bets and then checks, kind of capping his range, then we can bet there, and he can check, and we can bet again on the river. So we're always able to get the maximum number of bets out of our opponent's range when we're in position, but when we're out of position, we're not able to get the maximum number of bets out of our opponent without giving him an opportunity to fold a hand that he would have either bluffed with or he would have called down with if the circumstances were reversed. We'll come back to it. And it'll be elaborated on very, very deeply in the book. So one of the other advantages is post-flop playing skill. Everybody knows that. Everybody talks about that. The better player is going to make fewer mistakes after the flop. I mean, that's what a better player is, right? One who makes fewer mistakes after the flop. So by saying the post-flop skill edge means making fewer mistakes after the flop, you're not really saying much of anything at all. So if we looked at it a little bit deeper, and the book's going to go much, much deeper, excuse me, the post-flop skill advantage is going to boil down to how effectively a player creates lines. Does he create good? Does he have good default lines? And and I mean, is he going to be taking bet lines, bet lines, bet check lines, check bet check call check? You know, are his lines in a purely default manner going to be just tighter and better overall than most players? If so, he's going to have a big edge going post-flop. Also, the ability to spot leaks and imbalances in your opponent's games and really exploit those leaks and imbalances, or in other words, the ability to not only start with better default lines, but to be able to better adjust those lines to exploit specific patterns or mistakes that opponents are making. Ones that aren't talked about as much are better bet sizing and a more complete understanding of pot geometry, and understanding things like if we're dealing with pot-sized bets, how much, like how big a deal is it when I get that third bet in on the river? And it's huge, you know, it really is huge. So understanding pot geometry, and not just how big the pot's going to be able to get, but also how much of that money is actually profit. Depending on the number of players that are involved, the ranges that are going to call you, how much you have to risk on a bluff. If you're really good at bet sizing, you're going to be able to save money on your bluffs, and you're going to be able to gain extra little pinches of money on your value bets, and that's going to make all the difference in the world. And also, you're going to have a much easier time setting stacks up to get stacks in on or by the river. And another, I guess, aspect of skill and being a skilled player is just playing a less exploitable game, knowing that sometimes you kind of have to play a defensive poker game, and that's going to mean playing as close to GTO as possible until you can kind of look at what your opponents are doing and spot the imbalances. And then once you spot the imbalances, kind of move away from that GTO protective armor and open yourself up a little bit while you're exploiting your opponent's mistakes, and to be able to react quickly when you see them starting to react. So kind of this understanding of game theory, and having a good intuition about when somebody is adjusting or when they're about to adjust. So those are definitely some post-flop skill edges. Also, just better hand reading. When you're better able to read your opponent's hands, you're going to also make fewer mistakes against his hand, or well, his range, but also his hand. Card advantage. So this is a very important thing. The player that goes to the flop with the best hand is going to have the best chance of winning. If you're looking at just hot and cold equity, just like who's got the stronger hand right here, right now, in your pre-flop, going to the flop, having the best hand is going to be massively advantageous when the stack to pot ratio is going to be relatively small, and things like position and playing skill are going to be more important as the stack to pot ratio is larger, so you're playing deeper. The deeper you're playing going to the flop, so the smaller the pot is compared to the effective stack sizes of the players that are involved, the deeper, the more skill is going to pay dividends, and the more position is going to work to your advantage. If you are talking about playing in a 4-bet or a 5-bet pot that's, maybe a 4-bet pot at 100 big blinds effective. Things like position and skill edge are just not going to be as important as just starting with the best hand. So card advantage is going to be important, and the way in which it's going to be important is going to be, or how important it is going to be relative to the stack to pot ratio. It's going to take an awful lot of playing skill advantage to overcome a better hand if there's like a stack to pot ratio of 1. I mean, honestly, if one player has ace king and the other has queen jack, if one player has queen jack suited on the button, the other guy has ace king offsuit in the big blind, and you're say 300 big blinds deep in a single raised pot somehow. If the more skilled player is on the button, so the more skilled player has position with the queen jack suited against the ace king offsuit, I think probably the better player is in position. He's gonna be able to wield that queen jack suited more effectively, and he's probably gonna make money in the long run there. However, if you're starting out say 60 big blinds deep, and you're playing say queen jack suited on the button, and you make 3 times the big blind raise, and the less skilled player has ace king offsuit, and he pops it to like 20 big blinds. Maybe a very different scenario now that we're in a 3-bet, a very big 3-bet pot. If the hero, the better player, on the button does continue with the queen jack suited, we've got 40 big blinds in the center. Well, 41 with the small blind. 41 blinds in the center, and or really 40. Let's see, 20 big blinds and a small blind. 40.5 big blinds go into the center, and we've got 60 big blinds effective stacks behind. So we've got an SPR of 1.5. I'm going to say probably the worst player with ace king offsuited is probably going to win in this exchange. He's going to be in the more profitable overall scenario, unless he is really, really bad at poker, and the guy with queen jack suited is just like, never making mistakes, and is just playing really, really well. But starting with the best hand, or the most appropriate range, really, the most appropriate range for, or the most appropriate hand for the situation, is going to be how you're going to gain card advantage. And understanding how stack to pot ratio, implied odds, reverse implied odds, showdown value, and the ability to flop good equity, all of those things kind of go up and down in value based on different factors, like stack size, for instance, number of opponents in the pot, the ranges involved, etc., etc. So really, card advantage comes down to constructing better ranges, which is actually kind of a skill advantage. So these edges do blur; they really do. It does. I think I've said this before. It becomes at some point very hard to talk about one edge without talking about other edges, because they all sort of form one kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like a it's not just black and white segmented. It's more of a continuum, I guess. That's not the word I was looking for, but I think it's appropriate. Yeah, they form a continuum. Or really, I think an eloquent way to say it is just that the edges will tend to blur. Now, I've talked a little bit about the importance of betting and how that really is. I mean, No Limit Hold'em is first and foremost a game about betting. It's about knowing when to bet, why to bet, and how to bet, what hands to bet, how big to bet them, how often or frequently you should be raising in this situation, 3-betting in that situation, if you should be ISO raising or over limping. I mean, it's all about shipping money into the pot, and really calling too. It's definitely about calling as well. But it's a game about making bets and raises and calling bets and raises, and of course folding to bets and raises. But it's the if two players have a really good understanding of the game, but what I mean, let's say they know they're both equally skilled in terms of figuring pot odds and knowing race odds and equity, and knowing what hands to open from what situation, and all of the constructing ranges, taking good lines. But one player really understands sizing and is able to use good default bet sizing, but also knows when to exploit and shave some pennies off of this bet size and accomplish this. Understanding when opponents are going to be elastic or inelastic and how to take advantage of those situations. Really, that's going to give you a very big edge. Understanding pot geometry. I know I've already said it, but if you don't know what that is, Google it, or get on one of the forums and look it up, or ask me the question. If you don't know what pot geometry is, you need to know. It's like this whole other strategy level that exists outside of the standardish kind of talks that people tend to have about no limit hold'em strategy. I mean, there are like standard bet sizes like half pot, 2/3 pot, full pot, but that's not the whole story. Um, this is a table stakes game we're playing, and that cannot be ignored. That's a very big part of the strategy. Knowing that you are playing for, if you're say going to the flop heads up, you're playing for effective stacks. That whoever has the smaller of the two relevant stacks, that's the stack size, is massively important. Understanding your implied odds and how to kind of figure out what your implied odds might look like based on your opponent's range and those stack sizes is massively important. Understanding things like how much money do I have to bet on the flop that, if called, will allow me to bet a reasonable size on the turn, that if called will allow me to bet a reasonable size on the river, and if called get stacks in on the river. If you're not thinking like that, you're not doing it right. You've got work to do. I mean, this is fundamental. It's I think it's really, really misunderstood, and I don't know if understood, but underappreciated. I don't know if understood is a reason, but it's definitely an underappreciated strategic concept, and it's massively important. Um, it's just one of those things that it's like if you're just starting to get your head around it, you'll see it come up in spots like you'll be playing heads up, for instance, and you'll see that your opponent makes a bet size on the turn, and it just so happens to be sized out just so that if you call that bet, you will have exactly one pot-sized bet behind. So there's $50 in the pot, he bets $25. So if you call that $25, there'll be $100 in the pot, and you're sitting there with $125. You can be pretty sure that he is thinking about going for stacks on the river, or he is at least threatening your stack. He's at least threatening stacks. He's threatening to ship the river. Now, if he has no reason to believe that you understand pot geometry, it's unlikely that he's doing that as kind of like a levelly bluff. And he probably honestly is doing it because he plans to put his entire stack in on the river, either as a bluff or as a value bet. So it's something that if you're not aware of, just being aware of it is a massive advantage. This concept of bet sizing and pot geometry against players that are not aware of it. And kind of just a final thought on betting, aside from bet sizing and pot geometry, it's important and for some reason it's really hotly debated, but it's important to understand why we bet in the first place. And I've heard there's lots of different schools of thought and camps on this, and it's debated, and people kind of I think are confused by it, why we bet. For a long time there were tons of reasons. Back in the day when I started playing, players were pro betting for information. They were making raises for information to take their temperature and find out where they were at. They were betting for protection. They were pricing out draws. They were trying to start with the best hand, charge their opponent a bad price to draw out. I mean, that was the kind of rationale. And that's kind of been overturned. I don't think too many serious players are thinking along those lines anymore. Some are, but they're wrong. There's been a shift, like a paradigm shift, that went from that to there are only two and only two reasons to make a bet, and those reasons are as a bluff or for value, that you're only ever betting to get called by second best, get called by worse hands, or you're betting hoping to fold out better hands. And there's tons of players that still think that way. And there have been, I mean, even more in the past. It used to just be taught as the gospel. It was just the whole deal. And when you get to the river, it actually is pretty much the whole deal. I mean, there's other little things, but like, sometimes you can make an exploitative pro bet that can get your opponent to spaz out and shove a hand that he wouldn't have called a shove with, or even, that might be more effective than checking and calling because your bet looks weak or something like that. But, overall, that's just a secondary consideration at best. And the reasons to bet on the river are hoping to get called by worse or hoping to get a better hand to fold. But it's not strictly true on other streets, especially pre-flop. And on the flop, it's not as true, depending on the texture of the flop. So there is this other school of thought, this camp, that is still just really, really vibrant community of people. There's a big camp of players that think there are three reasons to bet. One, for value, two, as a bluff, and three, for protection. And then I think probably the majority of players that are decent, learned, thinking players that are studying the game would tell you that there are actually three reasons to bet in No Limit Hold'em. Two of them are major reasons, and one is a secondary reason or a minor reason or a reason that comes up some of the time but not all of the time. And the two major considerations are hoping to get value from hands that you're beating or to get folds from hands that are ahead of you. And that there's this other thing that is kind of a reason, or it sometimes is a reason, or it's a minor reason, which is for protection. And yeah, that's just kind of a wishy-washy thing. I have a hard time believing that anyone who believes that or says they believe that really thinks that they confidently have it figured out. I'm sure they've got to understand that there's something not quite perfectly right about that. And I'm going to get to that in a second, explain what that is. And then there's other players that just say, hey, there's only one reason to bet. And that reason is that it is higher EV than checking, and it's higher EV than folding. Like if you're in a situation where you could check, fold, bet, like or limp in, it's the best EV overall. But I just have a real problem with that whole idea that there's one reason to bet because it's the highest EV option. I mean, to me, that's exactly like saying, and I'll just say it is exactly like saying, the one reason to bet is because sometimes it's good to bet. So you should bet when it's good to bet. Well, I mean, no shit, right? It kind of falls into the no shit category, does it not? So the way I look at this is that there are actually only two reasons to bet. There are only two, forever two. There always have been, always will be two reasons to bet in No Limit Hold'em. Fold equity and value. You are going to bet hoping that your opponent will surrender his equity. So that's one reason to bet. Some of the time you bet, it is better that your opponent folds than if he calls, in which case you are essentially bluffing, but not always. I mean, sometimes you're betting with the best hand, but it's not for protection. You can't, quote, protect your hand. I mean, I don't even know what that means. It's like you can't protect. It doesn't make sense to even think about protecting your hand. If you have like ace-2 suited, and you're in the small blind, and the button opens, and you 3-bet, button calls, and you go heads up to the flop, and the flop is like, say, queen 7 deuce with maybe 2 spades, or well, 2 diamonds. I think. Yeah. Say you've got the ace-2 of spades, and maybe there's a spade also. Okay, so you're very likely better off betting in that spot than you are checking, because it is good to sometimes try to get hands like that to showdown. But I mean, when your pair is a pair of twos, every card is a scare card. I mean, it's good to induce bluffs, but not if you can't call them, right? So you're betting because it's the best thing to do. But the reason it's the best thing to do is because in this situation where you're out of position, you are better off if your opponent folds and surrenders their equity than if they call. So you could say you're value betting against floats and draws and that sort of thing, or overcards, but you're not. I mean, you're really not. You're just betting, hoping to fold out their equity. You've turned your hand into a kind of a semi-bluff, which is fine, but it's not protecting your hand. It's just the same thing as if you're betting and just straight up hoping for your opponent to fold the best hand. You're betting, hoping your opponent relinquishes their claim on whatever percent of the pot they deserve in terms of equity share based on the cards in their hand. Point blank, that's what you're doing. The only other reason that you would bet is to get money in the pot when you're a favorite to win it. And I don't mean that you're only ever doing this when you are the equity favorite. I mean you are betting in a sense for value. Anytime you are a favorite to win before or at showdown. So you're value betting. Sometimes you're taking a hand like, let's say, ace of spades, two of spades, and you're betting a flop that has like a 3 or a 4 or a 3 and a 4, and so you've got like 4 outs to a straight, a wheel, and you've got 2 spades on the flop, and you've got the overcard. So you've got nut flush draw, overcard, and a gut shot. And sometimes you're betting here, hoping for a call, even if you know your opponent's only going to call you when you're beat right here, right now. It can still be a value bet as long as you think the combination of your equity, the number of times you're going to improve and make the best hand, plus the number of times you're going to find a good card to barrel on the turn, and or river, is going to make sure that you win this pot more than 50% of the time. If you're going to win this pot with future fold equity on future streets because there's tons of good barreling cards for you, then it is often better for you that your opponent calls than folds, even if you don't have the best hand right now. If your opponent is a type of player who is very likely to put money in on the flop, but he gives up way too often on the turn, and even more often on the river, you could have nothing, and it could be a value bet. If you're betting, hoping that your opponent calls, or let's just say not even hoping that your opponent calls, but if you have a bet on the flop that if it is called, it is better or higher long-term EV for you than if your opponent folds, it doesn't really matter what your hand is right now. It's a value bet. If you just look at everything this way, it finally crystallizes and becomes clear that there are 2 reasons, no fewer, no more, no less. There's 2 reasons to bet. We bet hoping that our opponent will surrender his equity, and sometimes it makes sense to do that when we're ahead, but our opponent's drawing very live against us, and it definitely makes sense if our opponent is ahead, and we think he'll fold. I mean, that's fantastic. If your opponent folds the best hand, it still is reason number 1, fold equity. It's still the same reason we're betting. We're betting hoping he folds out his equity, and if he folds any equity, it can be a gain. If he folds more than his fair share of equity based on the price you're laying him, it's a huge gain. And if he's folding the best hand, it's a monstrous gain. But all of those things are gains, and they're a legitimate reason to make a bet. And sometimes you're betting for value because you have the best hand, and it's likely to hold up. So you're betting, hoping your opponent calls, because you're probably going to get to the showdown, and you're going to show down a winner. You have a very strong hand, your opponent has plenty of second best hands in their range that can and will give action on multiple streets, so you're value betting. But sometimes you're value betting in the sense that you're hoping for a call, or you'll do better, you'll benefit from him putting money in the pot on the flop,
even though you don't have a made hand, or you may have no kind of hand. Maybe you have Jack of Spades, ten of Spades on a board of 9 of Spades, 2 of Hearts, 2 of Diamonds, and you know that your opponent has a ton of small pocket pairs and ace highs in his range, and you know you're going to be able to barrel very effectively. You're going to be able to blast away at any spade. You're going to be able to barrel any, what was it, queen or 9? No, I'm sorry, queen or 8 that gives you an open-ended straight draw or a flush. You're going to probably be able to bet all of your queens and your jacks, at least one additional street. So with the combination of all those cards, if you can effectively barrel all of those cards, and if you don't barrel all those cards on the turn, you could still hit your hand on the river, and you are just greater than break even on this bet on the flop because of what could happen in the future. You can be value betting without even having a real draw. So I would just segment it like that in your mind. Don't get hung up on sometimes we protect, sometimes we don't. Does it make sense to bet for protection? Does it not? You know, sometimes you're betting for fold equity, even when you know you probably have the best hand and your opponent's never going to fold anything better. It's still better they surrender their equity than that you just let them draw for free. And sometimes you're value betting with a worse hand than your opponent is likely to have, expecting to get called a lot on this street, but expecting that your opponent will relinquish his equity on some future street. So these things flow together, but that's the way that I would segment them off, and I don't think you need to be any more complicated in your reasoning than that, and I don't think it makes sense to be so like not complicated, so simplistic in your thinking, that you just look at it as only one reason. Because unless you really know the entire game, and you've got the entire GTO strategy solved, which of course is not the case, then you can't really just say there's one reason to bet when it's the highest EV. Because you've got to have some kind of a shortcut to trace that EV out and figure out if you have plus EV on your bet. And instead of looking at all these other crazy reasons or wrestling with the ideas of 2 major and 1 minor, or a billion reasons, or 3 reasons, or only 2 reasons, I think fold equity and value, the definition of value is I will make more money on average if my opponent calls this bet, period. That's value. And fold equity is I will be better off if my opponent folds than if he calls, or if I give him a free card, or if I check and face a bet. That's it. You bet to fold out opponent's equity, where you bet hoping your opponent puts more money into a pot that you have the lion's share of equity in, or the best chance of winning it with a combination of equity and fold equity by or at or by showdown. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the book, and I might read another excerpt, may not. Until then, this is Navinab. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. Hope it created a bunch of thoughts in your brain, like maybe some firing of some neurons and some electrochemical reactions that will cause you to leave comments and buy my book. Till next time, guys, good luck.